For most of history, collapse looked slow. When Rome began to weaken, no one living inside the empire believed they were witnessing the beginning of the end. The streets were still full, trade still flowed, the currency still circulated, armies still marched under familiar banners. Collapse did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a process. Empires do not fall because of one bad decision. They fall because a sequence begins, a sequence so consistent that it has repeated across continents, cultures, and centuries. Once that sequence starts, outcomes change in speed, but not in direction. Rome followed it. So did Spain. So did Britain. So did the Soviet Union. And today, the modern empire is moving through the same stages, but at a pace history has never seen before. The first illusion every empire believes is that strength equals permanence. Rome believed its legions made it immortal. Britain believed its navy guaranteed dominance. The Soviet Union believed ideology could override economics. They were all wrong. Because collapse does not begin with military defeat. It begins with overextension. Every empire expands beyond what its productive base can support. At first, expansion feels like success. New territories bring prestige, influence, and short-term wealth. But every new commitment carries a permanent cost. Armies must be supplied. Borders must be defended. Allies must be subsidized. Eventually, the empire's obligations grow faster than its ability to pay for them. Rome stretched legions across 3 continents. Britain attempted to police global trade routes. The Soviet Union financed influence across half the world. In each case, the same tension emerged. The empire could not reduce commitments without losing status, but could not sustain them without breaking its finances. That tension always leads to the same response: monetary distortion. When taxes can no longer fund the empire, leaders turn to easier tools. Rome reduced the silver content of its coins. Later empires printed money, expanded credit, or manipulated currencies. At first, this feels painless. Soldiers are paid, debts are serviced, markets keep functioning. But the damage is structural. Currency debasement is not just economic. It is psychological. It erodes trust. Prices rise unevenly. Savings lose meaning. Productive behavior is replaced by speculation and survival. Rome experienced it through inflation and hoarding. Modern empires experience it through asset bubbles, purchasing power erosion, and permanent dependence on monetary expansion. Once currency trust weakens, borrowing replaces taxation as the primary engine of survival. This is where the debt spiral begins. Debt is seductive because it delays consequences. Leaders promise future growth will solve present obligations. Each generation borrows to stabilize the last. Eventually, debt stops funding expansion and starts funding survival. Rome borrowed from elites and foreign financiers. Britain relied on endless bond issuance. Modern systems issue new debt simply to service old debt. At that point, debt is no longer a tool. It is a trap. Interest consumes resources that once funded production. Capital flows outward instead of building inward. The empire slowly loses its productive core. This is the stage most people never recognize until it is too late. Because outwardly, the empire still looks powerful. Markets still operate. Institutions still exist. The flag still flies. But internally, the engine is hollowing out. Production declines. Manufacturing moves elsewhere. The empire imports what it once created. Skills decay, innovation slows, dependence grows. Rome relied increasingly on foreign grain. Britain lost industrial dominance. The Soviet Union could not sustain internal productivity. Every time, the same outcome followed. Social cohesion breaks. When resources shrink and promises remain, society fractures. Political division accelerates. Trust in institutions collapses. Elites insulate themselves. Ordinary citizens feel the strain first. Crime rises. Extremes dominate politics. Unity disappears. At this stage, collapse is no longer preventable. It is only delayed. And delay makes the final phase faster. Rome took centuries because information moved slowly, systems were localized, and economies were less interconnected. The modern empire has none of those buffers. Its systems are global. Its finance is instant. Its supply chains are fragile. Its debts are mathematical. Which means, when confidence breaks, it breaks everywhere at once. This is why history does not suggest a slow decline ahead. It suggests acceleration. What makes the modern collapse different is not the pattern, it is the compression of time. In earlier empires, failure moved at the speed of caravans, ships, and handwritten ledgers. Today, it moves at the speed of algorithms, capital flows, and instantaneous trust. This changes everything. In Rome, a bad harvest affected one province at a time. In the modern system, a single disruption can ripple across continents in days. A credit event in one market can destabilize dozens of others before leaders even respond. This is why the modern empire cannot rely on historical timelines for comfort. The most dangerous phase of collapse is not overextension or debt. It is the moment when belief breaks. Empires survive not because they are strong, but because people believe they are strong. Currency works because people accept it. Debt functions because lenders trust repayment. Institutions hold power because citizens comply. Once belief erodes, systems fail rapidly. History shows this clearly. In late Rome, citizens began refusing debased coinage. Trade shifted to barter. Taxes became impossible to collect. The state responded with force, which only accelerated decay. In later empires, similar moments arrived when bond markets demanded higher yields, when capital fled, when confidence vanished faster than policy could react. This is the mathematical trap of debt-driven systems. As debt grows, the system becomes more sensitive to interest rates, confidence, and perception. Small changes produce outsized effects. Stability narrows. Fragility increases. At a certain threshold, leaders lose control of outcomes. They can raise rates and collapse debt markets, or lower rates and collapse currency credibility. They can cut spending and trigger unrest, or spend more and accelerate inflation. There is no neutral option. Rome faced this when it could no longer pay legions without debasing currency. Britain faced it when maintaining global dominance drained domestic strength. The Soviet Union faced it when economic reality overwhelmed ideological control. The modern empire faces it through numbers that no longer represent real productivity. Debt obligations grow faster than economic output. Interest compounds faster than growth. Demographics weaken the tax base. Productivity gains fail to offset financial weight. This is not mismanagement. It is structural. Debt-based systems require continuous expansion to survive. When expansion slows, the system does not stabilize, it destabilizes. This is why the final phase often appears sudden. For years, the system absorbs stress invisibly. Then one threshold is crossed. Liquidity disappears. Credit freezes. Institutions fail in clusters. Governments respond with emergency measures that signal panic rather than control. Confidence collapses first. Everything else follows. Rome's final centuries were marked by repeated attempts to restore stability through edicts, price controls, and coercion. Each intervention reduced flexibility and increased fragility. Modern systems follow the same logic with different tools. Bailouts replace bankruptcies. Money creation replaces productivity. Regulation replaces trust. Each intervention buys time and increases the eventual speed of collapse. This is the paradox of delay. The longer collapse is postponed, the more compressed the final outcome becomes. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable reality. The modern empire has already completed most historical stages. Overextension is visible in global commitments. Monetary distortion is evident in persistent inflation and asset dependency. Debt has become permanent. Production has shifted outward. Social cohesion is fracturing. These are not predictions. They are conditions. The remaining stages historically do not take centuries. They take years, sometimes less. Rome declined slowly because alternatives were limited. The modern world offers instant alternatives. Capital moves without loyalty. Trade reroutes without sentiment. Currency trust shifts overnight. When confidence breaks, there is no buffer. History does not suggest a single dramatic event ahead. It suggests a loss of control, a period where responses no longer stabilize outcomes, but amplify them. This is why collapse accelerates at the end. Not because leaders stop trying, but because the system no longer responds to effort. The final mistake every empire makes is believing collapse will announce itself. It never does. There is no official declaration, no clear starting gun, no single day historians can point to and say, this is when it ended. Collapse is recognized only in retrospect, when the system that once felt permanent no longer functions. Rome did not fall in 1 year. It crossed a threshold where recovery became impossible. From that moment on, every solution created new problems faster than old ones could be solved. That is the defining feature of the final stage. In the modern empire, this threshold is not marked by invasion or revolution. It is marked by mathematics. When debt grows faster than productivity, the system depends on confidence rather than value. When confidence becomes the primary support, stability becomes fragile. And when stability relies on belief, belief becomes the single point of failure. This is why modern collapse will not look like ancient collapse. It will not be slow, local, or contained. It will be fast, global, and synchronized. Supply chains do not fail one city at a time. Financial markets do not unwind one country at a time. Information does not spread gradually. When trust breaks, everything moves together. History shows that once this phase begins, political decisions lose their power to steer outcomes. Leaders react, but reactions no longer control direction. They only determine who absorbs the damage first. Rome responded with more controls. Britain responded with retrenchment. The Soviet Union responded with repression. Different choices, same result. The modern empire has fewer options than any before it. Its debt is larger relative to production. Its systems are more interconnected.
Its population is more dependent on continuous stability. Its margin for error is thinner. This is why history does not support a gentle decline. It supports a sharp
adjustment. That adjustment may come through currency devaluation, financial crisis, institutional failure, or social fracture. The mechanism is uncertain. The outcome is not. Empires do not collapse because people stop working. They collapse because systems stop coordinating. Money stops signaling value. Prices stop guiding production. Trust stops connecting strangers. Once coordination breaks, complexity reverses. The system simplifies violently. Rome fragmented into regions. Trade shrank. Urban life collapsed. What took centuries to build unraveled in generations. The modern world is more complex, which means its reversal will be faster. This does not mean collapse happens tomorrow. It means the conditions that prevent it no longer exist. The speed of the final phase depends not on policy, but on confidence. And confidence, once lost, does not return on command. This is why the modern empire will not take 250 years to fall. It will fall faster, not because it is weaker than Rome, but because it is more interconnected, more leveraged, and more dependent on belief. History does not repeat in detail, but it repeats in structure, and the structure is already in place. One reason people underestimate collapse is because they misunderstand stability. Stability is not the absence of problems. It is the ability of a system to absorb stress without breaking. Rome remained stable for centuries not because it avoided mistakes, but because its economy, society, and information systems absorbed shocks slowly. The modern empire does not have that luxury. In Rome, local failures stayed local for years. A province could suffer without immediately destabilizing the capital. Trade routes were redundant. Economies were regional. Finance was slow. Today, none of that is true. Modern systems are optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Supply chains are lean. Inventories are minimal. Finance is centralized. Information is instant. This creates speed and fragility. When one node fails, the shock propagates everywhere. This is why historical comparisons often miss the core difference. People ask whether the modern empire resembles Rome politically or culturally. That question misses the point. The comparison is structural. Rome collapsed when complexity exceeded its coordination capacity. The modern empire is more complex by orders of magnitude, yet relies on even tighter coordination to function. Energy systems, food distribution, finance, logistics, healthcare all depend on uninterrupted trust and synchronization. Remove trust, and the system does not degrade gracefully. It snaps. This is why debt plays such a central role. Debt is not just money owed. It is a promise about the future. A debt-based system assumes tomorrow will be larger than today. When that assumption fails, the present becomes unstable. Rome accumulated obligations to soldiers, elites, and administrators. When revenues could no longer meet promises, loyalty fractured. The modern empire has expanded that model to the entire economy. Governments promise pensions, healthcare, security, and stability. Corporations promise growth. Financial markets price assets based on perpetual expansion. None of this can be fulfilled without continuous growth. When growth slows, promises collide. At first, systems mask the collision. Accounting adjustments, monetary intervention,
emergency policy. But eventually, reality asserts itself. Interest compounds regardless of politics. Demographics shift regardless of ideology. Productivity does not respond to narratives. This is why collapse is not a moral failure. It is a mathematical one. No empire collapses because people become evil. They collapse because systems promise more than reality can deliver. Rome promised protection it could not afford. Britain promised dominance it could not sustain. The Soviet Union promised abundance it could not produce. The modern empire promises
stability in a system that structurally requires instability to function. Debt requires expansion. Expansion requires resources. Resources are finite. This contradiction does not resolve slowly. It resolves violently. Another illusion is that modern technology will prevent collapse. Technology increases capability, but it also increases dependency. When systems fail, technology accelerates failure. Digital finance moves panic faster. Social media amplifies loss of confidence. Automation removes redundancy. Centralization concentrates risk. Rome had no such accelerants, which is why Rome declined across generations. The modern empire will experience compression, not because it is weaker, but because it is tighter. When systems are tightly coupled, failure cascades. This is why history suggests not a repeat of Rome's timeline, but a collapse shaped by modern speed. Another misunderstanding that delays recognition of collapse is the belief that systems fail evenly. They never do. Collapse is asymmetric. Certain sectors fail first. Certain groups absorb damage earlier. Certain signals appear long before the public narrative shifts. By the time collapse is acknowledged socially, it has already progressed structurally. In Rome, rural populations felt strain long before the capital did. Taxes increased, protections weakened, and local economies shrank. Urban elites continued living comfortably for decades, while the foundations beneath them eroded. The modern empire shows the same pattern. Financial markets often remain elevated, even as real productivity declines. Asset holders are insulated, while wage earners absorb inflation. Debt masks scarcity. Consumption continues on credit. This creates the illusion of resilience. But resilience is not measured by appearances. It is measured by margin. And the modern system has almost none. Margins exist where systems can bend without breaking. Inventory buffers, redundant supply chains, fiscal flexibility, demographic growth. Rome had margins early. It lost them over time. The modern empire entered the final stages already marginless. Its supply chains are optimized to the minute. Its labor force is aging. Its fiscal position depends on continuous borrowing. Its financial markets are leveraged on expectations rather than fundamentals. This is why small disruptions produce outsized consequences. A temporary shortage becomes a systemic shock. A localized crisis becomes global. A loss of confidence in one institution spreads instantly across the entire system. The fragility is not accidental. It is the result of decades spent prioritizing efficiency over durability. Empires make this trade because efficiency produces growth, and growth produces legitimacy. But durability requires slack, and slack looks wasteful during periods of expansion. Rome reduced redundancy to save costs. Modern systems eliminate redundancy to maximize returns. Both choices are rational in the short term. Both are fatal in the long term. Another critical factor is population psychology.
Collapse accelerates when expectations adjust. For most of an empire's life, citizens expect improvement. Even during hardship, they believe conditions will recover. This belief sustains compliance, investment, and patience. The final stage begins when expectations reverse. When people no longer expect improvement, behavior changes. They stop investing long-term. They stop trusting institutions. They seek security rather than opportunity. They prioritize immediacy over growth. Rome experienced this as land abandonment and declining urban life. Britain experienced it through capital flight. The Soviet Union experienced it through disengagement and apathy. The modern empire shows it through declining participation, institutional distrust, and financialization of survival. When expectations fall, systems destabilize internally. This is why collapse often appears sudden. It is not that conditions change overnight. It is that
Collective behavior does. Once behavior shifts, policy loses effectiveness. Incentives no longer work as designed. Signals are ignored. Authority weakens. Rome issued edicts to freeze prices. Markets disappeared. The Soviet Union issued production targets. Output collapsed. Modern systems issue stimulus and regulation. Participation declines. Different tools, same reaction. Because the problem is not insufficient control, it is insufficient belief. At this stage, empires often attempt to preserve the appearance of stability at the cost of flexibility. Controls tighten, narratives harden, dissent is framed as threat. This accelerates decline. Flexibility is how systems adapt. When adaptation is replaced by enforcement, brittleness increases. Rome hardened its bureaucracy. Britain entrenched financial interests. The Soviet Union centralized authority further. Each action reduced the system's ability to respond to reality. The modern empire risks the same outcome. As pressures mount, responses focus on maintaining confidence rather than restoring fundamentals. Markets are supported. Institutions are protected. Appearances are managed. But appearance management does not rebuild productive capacity. It only delays recognition. Which brings us to the final compression. When enough subsystems fail simultaneously, coordination collapses. Food distribution depends on energy. Energy depends on finance. Finance depends on confidence. Confidence depends on stability. Break one link, and stress spreads. Break several, and the system enters cascade. Rome fragmented region by region. The modern system has no such isolation. This is why collapse will not respect borders, sectors, or timelines. It will move along networks, and networks fail all at once. Every collapse has a moment when reversal stops being an option, not because solutions disappear, but because their side effects become worse than the problem they are meant to solve. This is the tipping point. Before this moment, intervention stabilizes. After it, intervention accelerates failure. Rome crossed this line when monetary reform destroyed trust faster than it restored solvency. Each attempt to control prices, wages, and trade reduced participation. Markets shrank. Tax collection collapsed. Enforcement replaced incentive. The modern empire faces the same constraint through different mechanisms. Interest rates cannot rise without collapsing debt markets. They cannot remain low without eroding currency credibility. Fiscal restraint triggers unrest. Fiscal expansion accelerates inflation. Every lever now pulls against another. This is why the idea of a gentle reset is historically unsupported. Resets require surplus. They require excess energy, excess productivity,
excess trust. Rome had none when it attempted reform. Neither did Britain in its imperial decline. Neither did the Soviet Union at the end. The modern empire has even less. Its debt absorbs future growth. Its demographics reduce labor contribution. Its infrastructure requires constant maintenance. Its political system struggles to coordinate long-term sacrifice. A reset would require accepting losses immediately in exchange for stability later. Empires rarely choose that path. They choose delay. Delay preserves the appearance of order. It maintains institutional legitimacy. It protects incumbents. But delay also increases compression. The longer imbalances persist, the more synchronized failure becomes. This is why the final phase often begins with something small: a banking stress event, a currency shock, a geopolitical disruption, a confidence fracture. The trigger varies, the reaction does not. Liquidity retreats. Risk is repriced. Trust becomes selective. Systems that depended on universality fragment. Rome saw trade routes collapse selectively. Certain regions failed first, others followed. The modern system does not allow selective failure. Global finance is a single organism. Supply chains are
interlocked. Energy markets are global. Information moves instantly. When fragmentation begins, it spreads everywhere. This is why modern collapse does not unfold as a linear story. It unfolds as a cascade. One system fails, forcing pressure onto others. Governments respond, shifting stress rather than resolving it. Each intervention buys time at the cost of future stability. Eventually, the system runs out of places to push the pressure. At that point, collapse becomes self-propagating. This is when confidence breaks decisively. Not because people panic, but because rational actors adjust. Businesses reduce exposure, households conserve, capital withdraws, participation declines. These are not emotional reactions. They are logical responses to uncertainty. But collectively, they destabilize the system. Rome entered this phase when landowners abandoned obligations and citizens withdrew from public life. The Soviet Union entered it when workers disengaged and production lost meaning.